Yes, hello and welcome back to the third and final video in the Painting Scarbust series. Straight into it, using pure ivory, and I'm using it on some pretty intricate textured detail on this cloak, which is some nice detail, but particularly tedious to paint if you were to do it in traditional method. And so this is another opportunity to use contrast paint. And so I'm basically using the ivory to almost dry brush, although it is with slightly moist paint. So it's more wet brushing than dry brushing. And really just making sure that each of those areas are covered and trying not to get too much of the shaded areas. So the advantage of using a contrast paint on this is again just a time saver. You could use normal methods, traditional methods here, and with this sort of textured detail, it would take you a fairly long time, and it would also be something you can make a lot of mistakes with. So using contrast paints just eliminates a lot of the opportunity for error. It's not going to be the final stage, of course, but using them to create some basic volumes is what we're doing. So this is a mix of Griff Charger grey and some green, whatever the green is, Creed green, I think, or something like that. It is diluted quite a lot, and I mixed in a little bit of the medium as always, just to help it flow a little bit smoother. And as you can see, I'm using this in a traditional wash method. So the medium is the key part here for creating an even finish, an even result, as opposed to sometimes just using the contrast paints directly. You can't really control the result as much. So this gives it a little bit more time, so you can pull color away or add color where you need. So we'll then go in with the hairdryer and quickly dry that off, which is what we're doing there. And I'm not just going to use the one layer of contrast here. I'm going to add a little bit of snakebite leather and to that mixture to give it a little bit more of the similar tones that the rest of the metallic sections have. So, and I'm going to be a little bit more concentrated where I place these shades. As you can see, the contrast has created some interesting light and dark areas, so I'm going to further reinforce the dark areas and keep the light areas a little bit more untouched, so that we can go in and do some shading and lights. So this is a new addition to the repertoire of what I've been using, and still sort of experimenting and learning the strengths and weaknesses and the characteristics of the paint, but quite enjoying a lot of the applications that they have. So pretty good fun, and definitely a time saver. So the color is dried on that trim, and it's created sort of an almost metallic sheen from where the contrast paints have sort of ended. And so I'm going to use some colors to reinforce those lights and try and continue it looking like metal, but evidently I'm doing that later as I go in to do this belt now. Fantastic, good stuff. That is a color called Charred Brown. It is a Vallejo Model Air color. I really quite like the Model Air range, and using it just with a brush as opposed to through the airbrush. They have a nice, strong, concentrated pigment, and so I find that using them with a brush can get some nice, strong colours, and also quite effective at glazing. So this is a bit of wet in wet on the horns here, just using again the Despair green and black with that charred brown, just to create a little bit of that shading and colour, and providing a base to work from for the eventual highlighting, which will not be done on this film, so not appearing in this film. Little Monty Python joke there, great stuff. So the leather of the belt, I'm going to use some similar concepts to what I did on the leather of the coat, but with belts, because of the shape and the way that belts work, they do tend to have much more specific texturing that comes from the way that they move in a consistent and regular pattern. So you tend to see a lot of these vertical lines and little scratches that are relatively consistent. And so the colours I'm using here is actually a blue-green, the same colour as I've used for the local area shadows, and a little bit of the orchid light, that purple, before moving into some ivory and ice yellow mixed into those colours. And again, just very much focused on vertical strokes as opposed to sort of more irregular and free-form textures. And again, that's just because of the way that particular object interacts in reality. All right, now we're going back to this metallic zipper textured thing. So I'm using a little bit of blue-green mixed in with the ivory, and being pretty specific with where these lights go. As always, a little bit of the medium in there, and you can see that I'm just reinforcing the areas where there's already light left from the underneath the contrast colours, and being again very precise, but also very much using the texture and the angle of the brush to make it a relatively quick process. So we'll further add more light just using the pure ivory. This is quite diluted though, so it's not as intense as some of the other areas, but just very, very simple, very easy to create some solid volumes on that texture by using the texture to help your painting. So again, if this was a competition piece, this is how I would start, but I would then potentially go back in and do more layers, more precise lights, as I'm doing with this here, and being a lot more specific with how I approach it. But for this piece, which is a demonstration piece, and you've already seen the main steps of the process, the sketching and refining. This is just a repeat of that same process, but on a different surface and with a slightly different approach. So I think you'd probably, if you saw a lot of my work in the flesh, as opposed to sort of online or on cameras, I do have a very, very high contrast style. So sometimes I probably overuse this sort of technique where I take a color up to an ivory and then glaze back down, because it creates that really high contrast. But I think when you look at a model not underneath a traditional light, that's when most models are going to be viewed, and so I think it has to look good underneath normal lighting conditions. So that's why I tend to have a lot of contrast. This is again using the contrast paints, and I'm actually a bit of Despair green mixed in with the contrast paints. A couple of thin coats here, again, just like a traditional wash technique. Leather is another, I think, super fun thing to paint, and I think once you start experimenting with the colors that you see on leather, that's when you start to get some really interesting aged leather effects. I recently did a paint job on the Big Child Creatives model Harald Shieldborn, and the leather on the model, I did heaps of interesting colors in there, which I think added to the aged feel of the leather. So just using some tints here of the blue green again, as I discussed in the previous video, the atmospheric condition, the ocean vibe, just trying to make that feel a little bit more evident by adding those bluish tones. And again, as I talked about in the very first video, the black will help frame the other areas and give you a much better, clearer idea of what's whether a section is finished or whether it needs additional work. So black lining the various bits and pieces to help section off each area, make sure it's its own individual element. It still works as a part of the whole. So at this point, we're looking at about an hour and 25 to 30 minutes. So pretty quick process. Again, there's a lot of technique, a lot of brush control aspects that help increase that speed. But I do think that the technique itself, the approach of the technique, is what helps it be as quick as it is. So only got a few bits and pieces left here for the actual footage before we sign off. There's I'm going to paint the details on the face and finish it. Sometimes I'll do this earlier, but I think it's probably one of the most important stages in terms of bringing the model to life. I think it's something you could do early, but I do like to work on various parts of the model before calling the skin tone finished. So if I wanted to go back in and do some more airbrushing on the skin, or work with the skin a little bit more, having painted the eyes would have just been a waste of time. So I've left it to this stage here when I'm pretty much happy with the rest. That's pure ivory again. For the eyes, there's a great article by Meg Maples on Arcane Paintworks, which talks through painting eyes in something like 6 stages. The first stage is painting the eye socket with a dark color, and then the second is using a grey. You never want to use a pure white, and you never want to use a color that is too contrasting. Eyes actually, if you were to look at them in real life, are very similar color to the skin tone, so very similar value. So I'm actually going to use ivory, and then I'm going to do a very thin glaze of color to darken them slightly. And the reason I'm going to do that is you tend to see a red rim around the bottom, around the tear duct, and around the lower half of the eye. And so using a wash in the eye sockets actually replicates that in a lot of ways, because the pigment will tend to concentrate around those areas. So I find that doing an ivory and then just sort of washing before going back in and tweaking that color a little bit more gives a more natural look. Pulling a new color into the rotation here, which is I think the only new color that I'm using. It's a scale 75 fantasy color. It's called Hastur Purple, I think, off the top of my head. Really nice color, very intense magenta purple color. And again, I think with the Arbuckle's brown, which is a slightly purple tone for the leather, using this to just add a little bit more intense color around the focal points of the face is important. So I'm going to use this, as I said, to do some glazes on the eyes and also the lips. Evidently, I'm not doing that now though. I'm going in and adding just a bit more contrast to the face. So I think I talked in the last video about how airbrushing can be a really powerful tool, but because it works with transparent layers, so you get that really nice soft transparent effect. That's also a bit of a downside when you've got strong contrasted intense opaque colors elsewhere. So at this stage, going back in and just adding those really strong highlights using a brush and that intense color. And again, probably the best example of this is if you were to take just a color like ice yellow and run it through the airbrush and do the skin tone, and in the same way that I've done in this way, and then you take that ice yellow and you do a highlight with it. The highlighted ice yellow, the brush work is going to be a different color than the airbrush color, and that's because the airbrush works with transparent layers, whereas the brush is a much more concentrated pigment. So it's important to recognize that. Had I left the skin tone on the face just purely airbrushed, I think you would see that translucency get a little bit lost in everything else that was happening on the model. There's a lot of very high value colors happening underneath on that chest plate and even on the trim there. So it's important that the highlight of this piece, the focal point, is the face. And so just using a little bit of ice yellow, and then I'll go in and further refine with a little bit more ice yellow and ivory, really just focusing on the key lights and where those need to go. So there's a few little areas where light would hit, particularly on a female face. You've got that the cheekbone, the bridge of the nose, that little chin spot there, and then a really, really important one is the eye lids, both upper and lower. I'm actually going to leave that until after I've completed the eyes, because generally I take a few goes at getting eyes right. So yeah, I'm just again working with the ice yellow, a little bit of medium, just to help it soften the transition. But you can see how much more intensity it's added to the contrast on the face. That's that Hasta purple that I put out about 10 minutes ago. What a legend. It's a lot of the scale fantasy colours are quite transparent. They have almost a transparent looks. It's almost like an ink in many ways. So I find just diluting them, works very much like a strong ink. So and you can see there the white colours on the face have really been toned down on the lips. That's just reinforcing the eyelid, the separation between the eyelid and the brow. If you were doing a male face, you'd tend to use a lot more of these little textures, a lot more of little volumes. But with a female face, it's really about getting the smoothness and the precise placement of lights and shadows. Alright, so little pupil, start small, grow bigger, not pupil, sorry, iris. Start small, go bigger. That one's a banger, well done. This one, not good. Very ordinary indeed. Got a little bit on the lower eyelid, so not great, but I can fix that. which I will do afterwards. But here I'm doing that reflective dot. Boom. Got that one spot on. Perfect. This one, Barry Crocker. No good. So this is a 1 to 10 scale model roughly. Quite small. I can paint eyes using various colours and a little bit more detail than I've used here, but because of the the feeling of the model, the very almost dark atmosphere, I felt like it didn't need to be adding more colour into the eyes. I felt like the dark black eyes fitted a little bit more appropriately. So maybe on a future video I'll go in and do eyes in some more detail. There you can see I'm really just tweaking the eyelids again, which is fixing up that messed up eye, and it adds a lot of character to the face as well. That don't breathe. When you get it right, it's a very satisfying feeling, and it isn't too difficult to fix. A little bit of black, particularly with the Chimera black, because it's so thin. It's very, very easy to just get a tiny little touch where you need to straighten it up. But yeah, if you ever get eyes right first time, it's a very satisfying feeling. So on lips, you generally only highlight the lower lip. The lower lip's the only one that sits in the light. The top lip is in shadow, and so the bottom lip is usually where you focus most of your highlighting. Lips are also slightly moist, so you do tend to see a little similar reflective light, similar to the way that you would do eyes on lips to really sell that. So here and at this stage, the next probably 10 minutes of video is going to be made up of me looking over the whole model and just assessing various elements, how they work as a whole. If there's elements that need to be tweaked, areas that need to be smoothed or refined, thinking about the focus, the focal areas, and using the whole model as reference. So the chest, the breasts, obviously not as smooth as the face in terms of the transitions. So just some quick work there to glaze some colour on and smooth those out, which is easy enough to do. This sword was done with the airbrush earlier, but as I said, it is possible to do that with a brush, and doesn't take too much longer. That little line down the centre of the chest, common mistake for new painters. If you Google chest, probably don't Google female chest. That wouldn't end really well. But if you look at some artistic photography, black and white shots of a male chest, and have a look at the way that the light actually interacts, that central line in between is an area where light actually gathers and reflects. Most people's default response is to treat that as a shadow, because it's quite recessed. So inverse of what a lot of people would normally do. Obviously depends where your light is coming from, of course, as it always does, but the majority of models that are painted with a zenithal lighting situation should see the chest have a line down the center. Again, this is the little touch of light I was talking about on the lips to sell that slightly moist effect. And if you look at sort of the rest of the areas, I think the obvious weaknesses of that shoulder pad is pretty evident. A little bit more work necessary to do there. the hair as well is still looks more green than black, and so this next little area, which is at times 1 speed, I'm working on making the hair look a little bit more black, and I'm also trying to create a little bit more contrast between the skin tone and the hair, and I'm doing that by actually adding a little bit more cold colours into the hair. So that's actually mixing a bit of blue-green in with the black, as opposed to the warmer greens I was using, the toxic waste green, and just making it a little bit colder. Black in a lot of lighting can look like quite a dark blue, so by mixing just a little touch of blue in, it helps structure this area from the quite strong green tones to a slightly more muted black. And so I'm then going to mix a bit of ivory in with that blue-green and that black mixture, and then work on the final light highlights on the hair. So hair works in many ways very similarly to non-metallic metal with a specular highlight, which is hits it on not necessarily the same spot you would highlight a normal surface with. It has to do with the angle of the viewer in terms of where the light reflects. And with, I think I talked in the first video, I did the wet in wet to start the hair off, and then have slowly built up the clumps. At this point now, I'm moving away from clumps and working now more on sort of individual strands, and trying to sell the effect that there is more than one strand of hair in this. Even though, given the scale, obviously we can only work with a very small scale, and seeing hair that if you looked at it would be the width of your finger, which is obviously not correct. But by using these very sort of thin lines, you can sell the illusion that it's hair. And you can see how that final light has changed the appearance from sort of a muted, non-reflective surface into something that does look like it's reflecting quite a lot of light, quite a glossy look. Again, you could work in on this significantly, and when I've done more competition style pieces, or something that I'm trying to achieve a specific outcome, that's something I would potentially work a little bit more in and work on those transitions. But for this piece, again, for demonstrative purposes and showing the techniques, I think the effect and the speed is more important. So just some similar processes here. So I'll go quiet for a bit. So just for reference, I've used 3 various brushes throughout this process. I've used a Winsor & Newton size 2, a Winsor & Newton size 1, and a Winsor & Newton size 0. All of them are the standard series, not the miniature series. Common misconception. People go for the miniature series thinking that it is for miniature painting. It means the brush length is a miniature brush length and will not have as big a reservoir for the paint. So here we're going to do some eyebrows. Crazy how much the eyebrows will change the appearance of the face. Really important to do, especially on a female face. Also very easy to get wrong, and in fact you're about to see it right now. Not a great first attempt at eyebrow, but again, relatively easy to correct when you get it wrong. Using a little bit of dilute water there to try and smooth it out, and then I'm going to get a bit of ice yellow and toxic waste green, and just change the shape slightly. Make sure that it's something I'm happy with. Very, 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 very easy to get eyebrows wrong, which is often why you don't see a lot of painters doing them. On busts, I think it's very hard to get away from doing the eyebrows. So do some research, look up eyebrows, have a look at where they start in relation to the rest of the eye, the sculpted eye, where they finish, where they're at their widest, where they're at their narrowest, and then do a little bit of practice. It's not an easy thing to get right, and I think a lot of people are scared of it, often because of that being one of the last things you do, and a mistake feels like it's something that's very difficult to correct. And in actuality, it isn't normally. It's relatively easy to correct, but a really vital part for adding a sense of emotion and personality to the figure. So this final clip is just quickly finishing off the other shoulder pad. I think I get this one a little bit more correct, a little bit more in line with how the light should interact with this surface, which is cool. Go me. But it's just again a repeat of same processes that I did before, same colours, so not a lot of additional value to derive here. So at this point I'll just sort of speak roughly about my goals and plans for doing these videos. So I do plan on recording more videos, and once I have capacity to do so, I plan on streaming some as well. One of the most interesting things in an article I wrote recently, which was again hosted on Arcane Paintworks, a psychology of miniature painting, I talk about the value of practice and the importance of being able to program your hands and your brain into knowledge. And there's a little chart in that article which talks about how much knowledge people retain from various tasks. And reading is generally, for most people, one of the least effective ways at retaining information. Watching videos is a slightly better one, watching a demonstration. One of the best methods for retaining information and learning is actually attempting to teaching others. And so I feel like I'm at a point where I want to try and continue to grow and improve, and that teaching is something that will help me on that journey. So that's the reason and the methodology behind doing videos and doing some streaming. We'll see. I don't have any real concrete plans around what I'm going to stream or what I'm going to record or anything. So willing to take on suggestions or feedback around what you want to see. But don't be offended if I don't do it, because as always, I find this hobby and this pursuit for me is all about enjoying what I do, enjoying painting, and you know, I find it very relaxing. You know, this model was a relatively straightforward 2 hours, so pretty easy to relax and enjoy process, not getting fixated on, you know, specific minute details. At this point, the model is effectively finished. I'm going to do a very quick black line at the top of the breastplate there. It's actually a great angle. You can see that just needs a little separation from the armor there, just to really define those two volumes. And then I'm going to hit it with the old AK varnish and call it a day. At this point, the model's effectively finished. I think I did about 5 minutes more work on the horns, and just adding a few more touches of the blue-green in and around the model to create a bit more visual interest. So that is that. This is pretty much the conclusion to the video now. I appreciate your feedback. Catch me on Twitter. I do have an Instagram and Facebook and other shit, so you can catch me on all of those. So there you go. The first video series complete, and that is a shot of the completed model. So signing off, Big Deno out.